one, it's amazing. But why do you guys visit museums? I'm happy to hear shout-outs from the audience. Shout-outs. Tell me why we visit museums.
To learn.
To learn. Okay, that's a great reason. Any other reasons?
Connect with the past.
Connect with the past. Okay.
It's fun.
And it's fun. It's fun to learn and connect with the past. I would agree with those. So up here we have several different photos from different kinds of museums, right? There's not just one kind of museum. That's the Holocaust Museum in DC, which can give us a really emotional, like hardcore experience, right? Underneath it is the Florida Museum of Natural History in Gainesville. That's probably the traditional museum experience, right? You go, you learn, you look at fossils, it's really cool. The third photo there is from the Clay County 1890 Museum. The Clay County Jail is what it's called, and I don't know if you guys have been to any of these or all of these, but it's a really interesting place. A lot of people go for archival records and to do research. There's the Muter Museum, which is a medical museum in, oh my gosh, where is it? Philadelphia. I wanted to say Pittsburgh and I knew it was wrong. I knew. And it's a really cool place as well. The lion out front of the Chicago Art Institute. Art museums are completely different, right, than a natural history museum. And of course, on the bottom, our pop culture reference, the Coca-Cola Museum in Atlanta. So these are all totally different places, right? And even though they're all museums, we get a totally different experience in each, and they evoke different feelings and teach us different things, right? So we go to museums, like you guys said, primarily to learn about the human past, the human experience, and I personally go to museums to be wowed by what other people in the past have been able to do, especially going to art museums and things like that. Why do we visit cemeteries? Any thoughts?
Family connections, obviously.
Family connections, okay.
History.
History, okay, that's a good one. Anybody else? Sorry?
Lay wreaths.
Say it.
Lay wreaths.
Oh, lay wreaths, okay. So visit our ancestors, right?
Peace and quiet.
Peace and quiet. Cemeteries are usually very peaceful. I would agree. They're lovely to kind of even just stroll around in. So I think a lot of the same reasons, and we'll talk about this more, that you go to a museum can be applied to a cemetery, right? You go to learn about your past, particularly, your ancestors and their deeds and the way that they're remembered, right? And maybe also to look around the cemetery and see who else is there with them. So it's a cemetery to me, and also to a lot of the folks at FPN, I think to a lot of archaeologists, are kind of like living museums, a living personal museum to you and your family and your culture, right? So that's honestly really pretty cool, right? So even a reason to visit a cemetery already. So let's talk about a few of our favorites around Northeast Florida. So have you guys, you can shout out if you've been to Tulamato Cemetery in St. Augustine. Yeah, it's a beautiful place. My picture here even has a little bit of the history, but Tulamato Cemetery was a Franciscan mission during the first Spanish period to the Tulamato people who were Wale runaways, so from South Georgia, people who had run away, and then they were missionized by the Franciscans in St. Augustine. So it was a village and a church, as most missions are. But however, in 1763, the Spanish ceded the state of Florida to the British, and the British dismantled the missions because they weren't about missions, not as Catholic, the British. And the site was not really used as a church anymore. So the Tulamato Cemetery is no longer an active cemetery. You can't be buried there. But they give tours on the first Saturday of every month. And I think it's been there so long, it's like totally rooted in the city's history. So if you take a ghost tour in St. Augustine, or perhaps a normal tour in St. Augustine, they will drive you by the cemetery and tell you either, if it's a ghost tour, they will tell you all sorts of fun legends. And if it is a regular tour, they will tell you facts about Tulamato Cemetery. Because it is really in the center of the city. It's a beautiful place. On their website, they even say, I think I wrote down a quote there. Let's see, where is it? They call it a distillation of St. Augustine history in less than 1 acre, right? So you can walk around Tolomato Cemetery on the third Saturday of every month. You can take a tour, and they'll tell you all about the history. And it is like a time capsule, stepping back into that first British period, or wow, that first Spanish period, and seeing what life was like there and reading the names is really impactful. Another cemetery that also has its roots in the Spanish is Bosque Bello, which, if anyone speaks Spanish, it means beautiful woods. And it is. It's quite beautiful there. This is actually still an active cemetery, but it was, it's in Fernandina Beach, as it says. It was said to be established by the Spanish in 1798. However, a lot of the markers that they used at the time were wooden, so a lot of them, unfortunately, are gone now. And the oldest marker that we have today is actually dated 1813, but we're gonna trust it. It's 1798, okay? So it's just a beautiful place. It's got all these, like, as our picture shows, it has these beautiful, like, Gothic structures. And again, a lot like the Tolomato Cemetery, it's a lot like stepping back into the past. You can do the time capsule experience. And it even goes further. So Tolomato is no longer active, right? So it stopped being active in the British period, so the history kind of stops there. This is a very long, drawn-out history, right? I can walk through and I can see graves from 1792, or I can actually from 1813. I can see graves from the Civil War, and you know, all of different time periods are there in the moment, which is really interesting. We can compare that to a totally different experience, right? At the St. Augustine National Cemetery, I don't know if any of you have been there. It's also kind of in the heart of St. Augustine, so there's a lot going on. As a national cemetery, it is a military cemetery, and like everything in St. Augustine, its past is very much pieced together, kind of. So it's all layered on top of each other because the city's so old. So it started during the Plains Wars in the mid-1800s as what they're calling a military post cemetery. So the oldest graves there are from 1832, I believe. I can check. Yeah, 1828, I'm sorry. And these were the people, soldiers who had died during the Plains Wars. There's also from this time period some unmarked indigenous graves from people who were taken as captives during the Plains Wars, and then they were captive at the Castillo de San Marcos for a number of years. They passed away, and there are two markers that say 6 unknown Indians on them, so 12. But there's been some work recently to give these people names. It's really interesting. After the Plains Wars ended, the cemetery was still in use. So there's also several Union graves in the cemetery as well, and it's probably best known for its lovely 3 pyramids. These are called the Dade Pyramids, or Dade Monuments. And they're named after, also during the Plains Wars, there was a massacre called the Dade Massacre. So they're a monument to all those whose lives were lost during the Dade Massacre. Okay. So cemeteries, they don't just have to be for everyone, or for military, or for religion, or wow, for military. There's all sorts of different cemeteries, just like there's all sorts of different museums. So this is from the Old City Cemetery in Jacksonville, which is also a historic cemetery. It's sectioned off because it's so old. So there's a Jewish section, which this grave is from. And it is the oldest, the Jewish section of the Old City Cemetery is the oldest Jewish cemetery in East Florida. As we can, actually it says it on the grave. But the Old City Cemetery, much like all of the other ones I've touched on, is really interesting because it is like a time capsule. A lot like Bosque Bello, you can walk through and find graves from all different time periods, and actually really interesting about this site is that there's graves from both African American residents and Confederate soldiers, and there's Jewish people and Catholic people, and they're all buried, well, I mean there's sections, but they're all buried in the same site, right? So this is a really fascinating place. So this is the Charles Demmett grave in New Smyrna Beach. This is a fascinating story here. he was a teenager who passed away in 1860 exactly, actually. Somewhat mysteriously, people say maybe a hunting accident, maybe, I'm not sure. Nobody knows. We're gonna go with hunting accident for the purpose of today. He passed away. His father buried him, as local lore says, exactly where he fell, which happened to be in like a forest glen, but as the area developed, people started building in that area and didn't want to move the grave itself because it takes a lot of paperwork and an archaeologist has to come out and help move graves. So instead they just built the road around it, which is really strange. So we do have this little tiny site right in the middle there. But it could still tell us a lot about, I mean, it's one grave. Let's look at this way. It's one grave, and I just spent 5 minutes talking about it and the lore and the legend. So I think that says a lot about the power of this site, and honestly, a lot of different cemetery sites.
Where's the dog?
Oh, they took it off. Yeah, so it did have an artist had, oh, it is?
It's back.
It's back? Okay. I'll have to update the photo then. I'm right here, just go back. So now that I've told you all about these cemeteries, why are we interested as archaeologists in historic cemeteries? This is a picture of my boss, Sarah Miller. A few years ago, she is the director of the Northeast region, and she is excavating a grave in an emergency situation, which we'll talk about later. So we are interested in historic cemeteries for a variety of reasons. For one, cemeteries are really important as ways to study the past. So we're going to talk about a lot of the different ways and things in cemeteries that we can use as research to find out about the past lifeways of different people and different cultures. For another thing, cemeteries are a really important cultural resource, right? The first thing you guys said when I asked why do you visit a cemetery is to visit your loved ones, right? So it's really important that way. So we want to protect and promote the archaeological resource, and we also want to use it as a research collection. So as a research collection, there's a lot of things, even just on this one marker, that we can study and find out more about the person and the culture and the time period in which this person was buried. So the first thing is art and aesthetics. We can look at the iconography, the way that the tomb itself is constructed, and the images that are placed on there. So those are all decisions that someone had to make, right? And they have meaning that way. We can also look at the architecture of both the layout of the cemetery itself and the layout and construction of the grave marker and the grave, right? So we can, I'll talk about this a lot more later, but we can look at the shape of it and maybe try to figure out things about the trends and the time period and what's going on there, right? We can also find out a lot about culture based on graves, right? What is more personal than your final resting place, right? Probably nothing. So we can find out about burial practices and like what people leave, grave goods, things like that are really important indicators of culture. We can also find out about ideas and attitudes towards death. So we'll look at a few examples of this as well, but we can consider like what the epitaph says, so the writing on the tombstone itself. And we can kind of find out like what these people thought of these other people. And we can find out a lot just based on just one piece of a culture, right? Likewise, we can look at memory and how people are memorialized. So again, looking at the epitaph, we can figure out what people thought. And even, I mean, a lot of them say, like if I were to just come up with a general one, it'd be like beloved wife and mother, right? So obviously, wife and mother are really two important things in our culture that it goes on that final resting spot, right? I mean, that's cool. Trends and fads, like I said about the architecture, and we can also do this with iconography. We can see what's popular and we can actually trace it through time and we can watch some things become less popular as other things are introduced. It's really interesting. We can also see socioeconomic status, class, religion, and other demographics based on grave goods, based on the style of the tomb, the material. I'm going to talk about them all, don't worry. So, we can learn a lot about culture based just on the artifacts left in graves, right? So this is from Sarah Miller's dig that I actually showed you guys a picture of her in the tomb. So she was doing cultural resource management in Kentucky, and she found, these are the cultural resources that she found, right? So there are, out of, I believe she said 600 graves when I talked to her about it. These were all of the gold rings, the first photo that she found. They're actually the first 2 photos. So if we think about that, if that's all the rings in 600 people's graves, what does that actually tell us about the socioeconomic status and maybe the class of the people who were buried there?
Not everyone was rich.
Everyone was rich.
Not everyone.
Yeah, so no one was rich. I would say no one was rich. Maybe like 10 people.
Or maybe they were in those pants.
I'm assuming.
Yeah, that's a great point too. So we can't make any like huge conclusions, but we could say either no one had rings to be buried with, so maybe they didn't have the funds to get them, or maybe they were passed down. Maybe their families wanted to keep the rings for sentimental or maybe financial reasons as well. We're not sure. The third photo here is really, really interesting. So these are a pair of eyeglasses, and I don't remember the dates exactly, but they were found in a grave that was a lot newer than the glasses themselves. So the glasses predated the grave, and they were tucked in this gentleman's pocket, right? So, and the other really interesting thing about them is that the glass itself was hand carved in France. They were able to trace it in France. So these glasses, and the way that they were tucked, so the fact that they predated the burial itself hints that they may have been an heirloom, right? And they were probably a treasured heirloom, especially if we look at the rest of the collection. They're probably like very expensive to get these hand carved. So they're probably a treasured heirloom passed down, and maybe they meant a lot to the person that they were buried with them instead of being passed on, right? The last thing there is a brooch, so another piece of jewelry that was found on this in the graves. On the second row, we can also look at hardware, right? So these are like the poles on a coffin. And we can see they're all pretty much the same style. This one's like a little longer. So that can indicate trends and fads in like grave creation. These are hinges and nails. So we can look at those and see sort of, again, trends and fads, what was going on, how are these people manufacturing these. These look like they're all, well, I can't say. Okay. And then on the bottom, we have grave goods, things that were left with the grave or the burial, right? So we have pins, we have coins, and we have obsidian, or actually they're jade beads, right? So these are things that people leave with their loved ones as they're being buried. So we have the coins. If people, we aren't really sure, but people always say like, why do you leave coins? I can ask you guys, why do we leave coins? Does anyone do that in their family? No wrong answers.
Military do.
Military do, okay, that's cool. I actually have never heard that.
It depends on whether you believe, it's not uncommon for humans to think that when they bury their loved ones, they're gonna live in an afterlife. You give them money, you give them jewelry. I don't know about this so much, but archaeology from before,
Yeah,
that's a whole afterlife thing.
Right.
I mean, I might think it's being practical, you might not want to put too much in, but no, I mean, I don't want to get into the Egyptian graves are incredible for that reason. That's part of our psyche, that you bury your loved ones with things you think they're going to need.
Right.
So maybe they need a coin.
Yeah, so maybe they need some money in the afterlife. Maybe they gotta pay the ferryman to get over the river, right? We don't know, but it's like a pretty common thing to leave goods with. Yeah, you leave them with you. Some people leave photographs. Those don't really stay well in the archaeological record. I know some people will leave like alcohol, things like that. We'll talk about grave offerings as well. Yeah, but you leave a little piece of yourself there for your loved ones, right? So even just looking at this really small collection, we've already figured out some things about the people who were buried here. And we can do more. So I haven't said it, but archaeology is a science, right? So we do our best to be as rigorous as possible, and we form hypotheses, and we test research questions, right? Unfortunately, archaeology is also very destructive. So once I dig in the dirt, I can't get it back the way it was before, right? So we have to do a really good job of taking notes and recording things so that our peers can come back and look at our research and say, oh, you did it right, I agree, or oh, this was horrible, you need to go back and do better. So whenever we're doing anything, we don't dig in graves, right? We would prefer not to. We want to leave them undisturbed. So one thing that we do when we do come across a grave, as this photo shows, is take really copious notes of what we can see in the most non-invasive way possible, right? So headstones are really great. We can do a whole survey. We're going to talk about non-invasive methods. We can do a whole survey of a cemetery without putting a single shovel in the ground, right? And that's the goal. So that's what we're going to talk about today is non-invasive methods and how to record cemeteries to get the best archaeological data possible. So this is just a unit, someone digging at a different kind of site. But so we're going to talk about recording and what sorts of information makes a really good archaeological survey, right? So one of the first things you can record in a visual walking survey is actually the material that a headstone or grave marker is made out of. So let's just think about this. So marble and granite are both really expensive, right? They're hard stones. They're usually like in demand. They don't go out of style. So they're going to be more expensive than, say, a wood or concrete headstone or grave marker, right? So if I see a bunch of marble headstones, then I know that we're dealing with something a little bit more in a different socioeconomic class than if I had seen like a concrete or a wood headstone. So we can think about that. One of the first things is just look at the materials. What are they made out of? Second thing we can do is look at the shape of the stone itself. I talked about architecture a little bit earlier. So we have classifications, right? Different typologies, so that if I publish my survey of a cemetery, other people can come and look at it and say, they can understand what I mean if I say I had 10 tab-in sockets, right? So it creates a common vocabulary where we can all talk about cemeteries and understand what we're talking about, right? Which is really important when we're trying to share research. So we can start by looking at the way that a tombstone or a tomb or a headstone is formed. And we can sort of look at these and figure out things like trends, fashions, or maybe something's cultural. We can also do the same with iconography, and here it gets really interesting, right? So by iconography, I mean all of the little stylistic changes on headstones. So these are famous for being they change like every decade, right? So there's some really famous studies that have been done on looking at the iconography of tombstones and comparing it decade by decade and seeing how different trends change. So we can actually do that just here. So we can see this was done in a cemetery from 1720 to 1820, and we can see there's 3 different classifications that the author came up with. In 1720, we can see that death's head was like the most, it was 100%, that's what everybody wanted. And by 1760, we started to see another one, right, the cherub. And then as soon as that one started taking off, we see the decline of death's head, right? And then the cherub, not super popular for super long, right? It kind of starts to die off, and we get this urn and willow style that becomes really popular and takes over by 1820. So this is really cool, right? We can track things just as simple as what's on the headstone, right? And we can come up with all sorts of information about what's going on in the era. And we can do some background research, right? Like, I don't know very much about death's head. I don't know what that means, personally. But if I were doing a study on it, I would look it up and I would figure out where it came from and why these people are using it and what it means to them, right? And then we could maybe figure out what's going on in 1780 that it suddenly stops being so popular. We can kind of do something similar with transcriptions. So what's actually written on the tomb? Transcriptions are really important because you can find out not just about the individual, but also about the types of things that are really important societally, and also we can figure out some things culturally as well. So this actually gives us instructions on how to do transcriptions, which is really interesting. So you want to copy, say if I were writing the transcription, I would want to copy everything exactly as it was. So this allows me to find the mistakes. For instance, I don't know, can you guys spot a mistake on here, on the tombstone itself? January is spelled wrong, right? What? I thought I heard another one. Also, there's no space between August 26th and 2007. Those are the two I found. But, so, if I looked at a ton of tombstones and I see a bunch from 2007 and January is misspelled on all of them, that tells me something about the person who's making these tombstones. They do not know how to spell January, which is cool. Yeah. There's also a bunch that have backwards ends on them. They're hand carved and they have backwards ends. I don't have a picture, unfortunately, but it was tracked and it ended up being like a cultural. They ended up being able to track it to just one like subculture, the backwards end. So that's the sort of thing you can find out from transcription. We can also look at, speaking of like hand carving, so all the letters are pretty much the same here. We know this was probably like machine made. If I go back a few slides, oh, there was. Oop, it doesn't know. Okay, I can see this tombstone here is clearly hand carved, right? And also forgotten is spelled wrong, but in memory of our father. So that was in 1948, so they could have had it machine made, but didn't, so that could tell us something about socioeconomic status, and maybe the class of the person who made it, or who was buried there and who made the tomb, right? Oh, did you find some misspellings?
Misspelling in there.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure. Forgotten is misspelled, right?
Is that March?
Yeah, MCH is the abbreviation for March. Yeah. But it's interesting, they don't have a month for the birthday. They're just like 1860. So we can look at the transcription, which we just did. We found out January is misspelled. We did it. Okay. We can we can contrast that beautiful, heartfelt message with some other sorts of trends in tombstones, right?
I went to a cemetery in Key West.
Oh, I love that one. I think I know.
And I'm assuming it's a guy. I don't want to sound sexist,
Yeah.
but on the tombstone it said, "I told you I was sick."
Yeah. I've seen that one.
That's permanent, right?
Yeah, that's there forever. That's the guilt trip of a lifetime.
I told you I was sick.
I told you I was sick. I really was a nice guy. So yeah, it's really cute. I'm not sure what's on the other side, but it could be that he had like a heartfelt message on the other side. But we can see a difference there, right, between the Joan Shaw headstone, which has "Miss You Forever, Sunrise, Sunset," so that's a really heartfelt message, right, versus "I really was a nice guy, I just meant to make people laugh," right? So there is a difference there, but that could be individual, it could be cultural. We don't really know. I just wanted to point out that there are different styles of headstones, and they are very individual. So another really important portion of archaeological studies of graves and cemeteries is grave goods. So I'm sure you guys are all familiar with it. Most people, a lot of like Christians will leave flowers on graves, right? You bring a rose or something like that. Jewish tradition indicates that you should bring stones. There's a lot of different reasons why, but I've always liked the idea that flowers will die, but stones never will. So your like feelings and love for this person is immortalized in the stone, and then they pile up as you visit. So it's a literal pile. Yeah, it's beautiful, right? Yeah. So it becomes a sort of memorial in itself of your love of this person and your memory of this person. People also oftentimes leave shells for a variety of reasons. A lot of different cultures do it. I know you guys have all probably heard of like Dia de los Muertos, Day of the Dead, where we bring offerings on certain days. And there can also be alcohol, food, things like that left on graves as well. And what these tell us is that it tells us a lot about the culture of the person who passed away and also the culture of the people who are visiting, right? So if there's a bunch of stones on a grave, I know it's probably a Jewish burial, even if it doesn't have a Star of David on it. I know if on November 3rd, right? Is it November 3rd? November 4th? On Dia de los Muertos, I know if there's a lot of offerings on a grave that they may be Mexican American or have a Mexican heritage, right? So just a quick survey would tell us a lot about the person who's buried there without having to do any sort of invasive testing, right? Cemetery, those are like the best case, right? I can walk a cemetery and find out all of this just by looking at a headstone. But sometimes cemeteries aren't as neat as they may appear, right? So sometimes burials are missing or forgotten, or the marker has unfortunately weathered away. And sometimes the graves themselves are no longer recorded, right? So I talked about Velo Vasque, which has the wooden markers that were weathered away. So this is in St. Augustine as well. We can use something called ground penetrating radar to find indications that there may be burials somewhere, even if there's no headstone. So ground penetrating radar is just as it seems. It looks like a lawnmower. It's kind of funny. So it's a device, and it sends radar pulses into the ground. And if they hit something that is not like the rest of the ground, they will return an anomaly like this, right? So these are anomalies that the radar finds. And they could be anything, but if you're standing in a cemetery, they are possibly graves, right? So this is our graph of the anomalies, and then this is where they did the ground penetrating radar. So where the trowels are sticking up out of the ground are some of the anomalies, and the rest are where the volunteers are standing. So that's a lot. So that's really important to know, right? If we're gonna open a new plot in a cemetery, or perhaps if they're going to do construction on the other side of the fence, and they might come across something, right? Because sometimes it's not as neat as it seems. So it's really important to do tests like these as well, especially before construction. There's also cadaver dogs, which I think people are really most familiar with from like CSI and shows like that. So it's the same sort of training for these dogs. Basically, they're trained to find the scent of human remains, and when they do, they bark or have a certain towel, right? And they're sometimes used in the field. I was just reading about their use in Iraq to find ancient tombs. Really interesting, but they're not 100% accurate. Neither is their ground penetrating radar, so we can't really tell if there's a grave, unless we ground truth it. This is a soil core, so you can see changes in the stratigraphy of the soil, which could be it could be a grave, doesn't have to be. So we can't ever say that there's a grave unless there's excavation and ground truthing done. So this is the worst case. This is the worst thing that could happen, right? This was, again, Sarah Miller's project in Kentucky, I believe. And she basically what had happened was sometimes cemeteries are forgotten, right, if they're not recorded. Sometimes they're intentionally forgotten. Things happen. So this one was forgotten, and it was never recorded. And after they started doing construction, they accidentally found the cemetery in the worst way, right? So they had to stop construction, and a team of archaeologists had to go out, record as much information as they could about the cemetery, and then relocate it, right? So then they can begin construction again. So basically, when this happens, they have to relocate entire cemeteries to other places, which is, as you can imagine, a great deal of effort and work. So that's what was avoided with the Charles Dummett grave, right? This is what they didn't want to do, even though it was just one, but they didn't want to do it. So how can we avoid that, right? That's kind of our goal with cemetery protection and cemetery resource training. We can record as much as we can, right? So we can do photography to just snap some photos of a cemetery, because, I don't know, maybe in 100 years, someone will have forgotten it or something. right? Or that stone might not always be there, or it might be too weathered. So it's really important to get good photos in cemeteries. It's also really important to clean cemeteries. So this not only protects the cemetery from like being forgotten or the stones from getting too weathered, it also actually protects from looting and other nefarious activities. Because if a cemetery looks like people are keeping it up, right, then you're less likely to get people breaking in. So this actually really protects cemeteries. So cleaning is really fun, actually, and quite easy. All you need is a soft brush. I have used a toothbrush before, and some water. And you can also use D2, which is a biocide. You should never ever use bleach because it will stain the stone. So you'll get this like weird rust stain on it. So D2 doesn't do that, and I can show you guys. It actually will continue cleaning, like it will continue killing the microbes, the plant microbes, even after you've left. So, and it makes the stones really beautiful and white. So, this is before cleaning, for just one example, right? It looks pretty gnarly, but this is immediately after cleaning it. So you sprayed it with your D2, you sprayed it with your water, and this is 3 weeks after cleaning, so that's a huge difference, right? Yeah, and it's really easy. It comes in a spray bottle, and you just spray it on there. It's amazing. And then you can scrub it in a circular motion with your toothbrush, or soft bristle, oh my gosh, soft bristle brush. There it is. Okay. Another thing that we can do to protect cemeteries is outreach, what I'm doing today, and what I hope we can just continue doing. What you guys can do, actually, is visit cemeteries, make sure they're known. We also have this thing in Florida, it's called the Florida Master Site File. And it's really important because what it is a record of all of the archaeological sites in the state of Florida, right? Including cemeteries. So historic cemeteries are on there. So if there's a record of it, it is much less likely to get destroyed or accidentally. And also construction companies are obligated to actually look at the master site file before construction is planned. So if it's recorded, if it's on the master site file, it will be seen, right? So one of the most important things is to actually record these cemeteries and make sure that they're in there and that people know about them. So we need to keep visiting. We need to do interpretive things like I'm doing today. And there's also a lot of electronic resources and events and things like that that we can do to continue to make sure that cemeteries are visited. So an electronic resource like a blog, right? This is from Tullamano Cemetery Times, which is a really just nice blog that they have about Tullamano Cemetery, and it has a lot of their like programs and things like that on it. So they update it regularly, and people can look at it and find out more about the cemetery itself. We can also do things like reenactments, which I feel like, you guys have all been to reenactments, right? They're a lot of fun. There's people marching in costume down the street. This is at the St. Augustine National Cemetery. So people will see all of this going on and be curious. They might ask questions, they might join in, they might follow the reenactment. And that's a really great way to get people to learn about history and to learn about cemeteries. So, visit a cemetery, but leave your bleach, your rubbing paper. Rubbing paper is not great for transcriptions. Your flour, people will sprinkle flour in the transcriptions too to make it easier to read. The best way, okay, I'll tell you guys, the best way to read a transcription that you're having trouble with is actually to shine a flashlight underneath it or use a mirror and play with it until you can read it. But the light is the best way because it's, etched usually. So if you can like shine the light at the right angle into the etching, you'll be able to make it out better. Don't put shaving cream on them. Don't scrub it off with wire brushes. And unless your dog is a cadaver dog, please leave him or her at home. So in conclusion here, cemeteries are really important resources, right? Not only for like individuals and people, but also for whole communities. We can visit them just like museums, and we have to protect them and do outreach just like museums.
Hey, join me in thanking Jillian.